I'm sure you've been kind of maybe seeing some things about Sri Lanka in the news. But I just also want to stress that we are moving into another phase of severe hardships for people on the ground. Things have been quite challenging. People's lives have been kind of upended since the beginning of this year, and people were just, trying to come out of the effects of COVID and lockdowns and so on. And, right now we are going into another very difficult phase. In the last 2 weeks, there's been massive fuel shortages. People who have been forced to just stay at home, including the public sector workers, have been informed to work from home. The work week has been shortened from 5 days to 4 days, and food prices have skyrocketed. I think as Devaka mentioned, I just noticed that in June, the food inflation is almost 80% now, and overall inflation is above 50%. So food prices have really gone up. And so in terms of the food crisis, that's something that's central in people's minds. Last year, the government implemented an erratic policy to ban chemical fertilizers in the pretext of trying to promote organic fertilizers. But it was they were trying to do it overnight, unplanned, unconsulted, without much consultation from farmers and so on. So right now, fertilizer prices have again gone up. What was like 4,000 rupees a liter of fertilizer is now 40,000 rupees a liter. And farmers are actually choosing not to cultivate in the next season. We have 2 main seasons. In the last season, we saw that food production, local food production, has dropped by about 50% already, and so that's going to contribute to the kind of the hardships people are going to face in terms of access to food. In addition to what already Devaka has mentioned in terms of the shortage of dollars and the inability to kind of access global markets, which is the main reason for the crisis right now, including the debt crisis. Sri Lanka has always also been dependent on imports for some essential food items, particularly for cheap foods. The urban poor, for example, have been kind of dependent on imported food items. Milk powder is something that everyone uses. It's important, particularly for women who want to go to work. It's an easy option. And so, the crisis is also hitting the low-income households, not just, middle-class families who are used to kind of purchasing luxury goods and so on. In terms of livelihoods too, we are already seeing so much of change. The majority of Sri Lankans are dependent on the informal sector, which means, on daily wages, precarious, work, lack of steady incomes. And that's how it was, all along. Most people are in the rural sector as well. We have seen that there's been increase in debt at the household levels too. Microfinance, for example, has been in an issue, particularly targeting women who become indebted because of microfinance loans. There were even protests in a few years back against microfinance companies, particularly in the north and east post-war, when those areas were particularly targeted by finance companies. And so the people's livelihoods were very much focused on subsistence, which means they were just producing enough to sustain themselves, and on debt. And people were trying to migrate from rural to maybe urban spaces and abroad. And so they've also dependent on remittances that, workers, people who would go to the, say, for example, Middle Eastern countries as domestic labor would send back money. The Sri Lankan economy itself is dependent on foreign remittances by domestic labor, and then on plantation workers. and tea exports, and garment factory workers. In all of these three sectors, they are the main foreign dollar revenue earners for Sri Lanka. In all of these sectors, it is women's labor that contributes the most to the economy. And so, in some of the protests, particularly in the free trade zones and so on, we can see some of the slogans that the workers have been using, asking where has have our hard-earned dollars gone, right? Because it's, now the government is saying that we don't have dollars to purchase fuel and essential things that we need for the economy. So this is kind of, the situation in which, people's livelihoods have shrunk. And now even for, say, Sri Lanka is an island surrounded by the sea, but fishermen are unable to go out to the sea and, fish because there's a fuel shortage, and, they get enough fuel to go out to the sea only once a month or twice a month. And so, that has been the main kind of source of protein for people in Sri Lanka. And even that has kind of, is come to some kind of a crisis situation. We are also seeing that, education has been disrupted. So there's a group of young people who are dropping out of schools, trying to find work to support their families. And so we're seeing the kind of the long-term kind of impact of this crisis already emerging. People have stopped, almost 70% of households have reduced their food intake, or have reduced the number of meals that they eat, which means, even in terms of nutrition and so on, right? So this is the kind of impact of the crisis that people are facing on a day-to-day, everyday level. And for them, this is, when you ask them, this is what the crisis means. And as Devika mentioned, there's been a lot of discontent on the ground, lots of protests happening, lots of mobilizations. We've always had protests, but I think, what we've seen this year is unprecedented, not just in the number of protests all across the country, but also in terms of the groups that have come out and have participated in the protests, including even, generally it's the working class people or the students, student unions who we would see protesting on the road. But this time we've seen middle class folks too coming out and protesting because there is like a downgrading, right, in their lifestyles as well. There's electricity cuts, businesses are shutting down, people are being forced to take public transport when they have been able to, go about in their private vehicles and so on. And so it's unprecedented in that sense. And after a very long time, we also had general strikes by trade unions. The 1953 strike that Devika mentioned was a major one. And, for a long time, we haven't seen major general strikes like that, but now we're seeing that, and we might even see more of that in the next few weeks and months. And so I think there's been a massive mobilization. The main demand was that the president should resign, because the people are very disappointed with the way he has handled the crisis, as well as, the Rajapaksas, his family, his brother, the prime minister was forced to resign mainly because of, the protests that pushed him to do that. And in addition to that, there's been some kind of interest in abolishing the executive presidency, which has contributed to kind of this centralization of power, authoritarian kind of rule in the country. However, on May 9th, that was a day when the Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa resigned, but he resigned, before he resigned, he kind of instigated violence against what has been largely a peaceful protest in the country. And again, there was a backlash when thugs went and attacked peaceful protesters. Many of the properties of ministers were burnt down, including the properties of the Rajapaksa family. A member of parliament he died in the process. And it kind of changed the atmosphere of, what was largely a peaceful protest. The other significant thing that happened was a new prime minister was appointed, Ranil Wickremesinghe, who's already been, a prime minister for, I think, 5 times, if I'm not mistaken. And he did not even manage to win a seat in parliament in the last parliamentary elections. He was squarely rejected by the people. But he's, someone who's committed to neoliberal policies, and those elites, local elites, but also even, international actors kind of saw that as a good move to appoint him as prime minister. And this kind of marred the kind of protest movement. It kind of deflated their demands and also kind of created a bit of confusion. The language of, political stability is something that's very important to ensure economic stability was used to justify bringing this new prime minister in. But it's just been a month, and I think we are already seeing that, even his position is precarious. There was expectation that he will be able to bring international kind of help to get us through this crisis, but that's not happening. There was also an attempt to bring in a new amendment to the Constitution as a way to curtail the executive president's powers. But, a draft was gazetted just a day or two ago, which is a watered down version of, what people have been expecting in terms of abolishing the executive presidency. So there is a political crisis right now in the country, right? We have neoliberals, as Devika mentioned, from April, in the driving seat. We have an authoritarian president who is totally delegitimized in the eyes of the people right now. And both of them don't have the ability to mobilize people, right? And in an economic crisis, we need to be able to mobilize people to, to come out of it. And so there's really no stability at the moment. And we are seeing like another wave of protests starting to emerge right now in the country. So, I mean, this throws out a lot of questions. One is like, Sri Lanka has been a dependent economy, which means that, we have been susceptible to whatever global economic shocks. And, even before Sri Lanka went into trade liberalization and a neoliberal policy regime in the 1970s. But since the 1970s too, right? Like, I mean, now we are seeing so much of kind of change, for labor. But in the 1970s too, with the structural adjustment program that the IMF and the World Bank implemented, we've seen kind of major changes to labor. Right? For example, if you look at women's labor, there was a migration of rural to urban areas because export processing zones were created to produce commodities for exports. And it was women's labor that was mainly absorbed into those export processing zones. And the rural economy was just ignored for so long. The government stopped investing in even some of the small cottage industries where women were employed earlier. And now we are seeing again, people trying to go abroad, trying to leave the country to find employment elsewhere, and the government sort of kind of encouraging that, because post-liberalization, the way the government has dealt with the lack of jobs, in the country is also to kind of export, its people, send them to places where they work under very harsh conditions, right? Where labor laws are not implemented properly, where wages are low, and so on. And with the ethnic strife, we had a 30-plus-year-long war, and that is the way ruling parties were able to kind of consolidate power with the singular Buddhist majoritarian kind of nationalist mobilizations and the kind of racist rhetoric they would use against minorities. The Tamils were targeted earlier, but post-war, the Muslims were the main target of, those mobilizations. And so the next question is about, what would happen right now, particularly in the way the economic crisis is going to be resolved, right? Because the nationalist kind of ideology is still very potent. The Rajapaksas may not have an opportunity again to, take the control of power, but the ideology is very much alive. And, how would other aspirants, people who want to kind of come into power, how would those groups use racist ideology, right, and nationalist ideology to kind of come back to power is a question. Or would we see, like in the way the crisis will be resolved, would we see like a shift and an opportunity to kind of heal some of those ethnic rifts that have taken place? And, is there an opportunity for like working class solidarities to emerge, right? And with an economic justice program that can be implemented. I think Sri Lanka got a lot of things wrong in our post-independent history, but there are some things that we got, we did well. We were, the first country in Asia to gain universal franchise, right? Voting rights for everybody, first democratic country in that sense. We also have, post-independence, there was a social welfare state which expanded a lot of, benefits to, including to working people. We have free health and free education, which have been the two main pillars of, development for the country, and which remains to this day, even after we moved into neoliberal policies, we've been able to maintain it. And over the years, although we've seen an increase in authoritarian tendencies in the governments that came into power, people have also been able to throw out governments through democratic means, right? And so we still have that hope. And even though, we've been told that, again, an international savior in the form of the IMF will save us, there's a lot of skepticism. We can only, look at it with skepticism. We know how, it happened in many other countries, and we've already been through 16 agreements. And so I think right now we are again at an important juncture. We'll have to see, how the new wave of protests are going to take shape. So I think maybe stop there and we could go into discussion time.